Alrighty, and we are live for, I can't believe we're already up to episode 15 of this, and it's only the first, what is it, the first day of March for me. You're still stuck in February over there, Candice, but welcome to Eat Sleep Tennis for another episode. We're covering off the ATP tournaments that we have on offer this week in Rotterdam and in Buenos Aires. And I guess now is probably the best chance. Welcome, Candice. Thanks for coming back on. I know you missed us yesterday, but you've basically come in and replaced Alex, who couldn't be with us today.
He couldn't be with us because he committed a tennis sin.
He did, and it was probably the biggest sin of all. So we have had to give him a 1-episode suspension just on the ATP side. For those of you who tuned in last week, Alex did put Ernest Gulbis as his value pick for the tournament, and we know how well that went. I don't think he even won a set, did he? I think he lost to Mark Corder in the first round.
I mean, it was a very Ernie display.
It was one. He looked good for about 7 minutes, I think, and then things really went downhill, I think, once we got to that 5-all in the first set. So Alex is taking the week off on the ATP front, and I think he's obviously busy with a lot of other things that he's doing at the moment as well. So we're going to hold the fort here and cover off these two tournaments. So we'll start off with the Rotterdam tournament. So that's on the indoor hard court over in the Netherlands. And it notoriously, I think from years gone by, has been a slightly slower hard court. But what we're seeing here is a lot of these players that we haven't seen basically since the Australian Open. So what we'll do is we'll run through half by half, and then we'll jump in and go through our picks. And we've also got Alex's picks as well to keep us going through here. So looking at this first half of the draw, we've got the Australian Open runner-up, Daniil Medvedev at the top. And the other seeds in this section, we've got Felix Auger-Aliassime, Alexander Zverev, and Roberto Bautista Agut, who's coming off a 3-set loss in his finals appearance just a couple of hours ago, really. I think that one was. But a couple of interesting names here, I think, that were seeded, obviously, at the Australian Open with the higher seeding. We've got Borna Coric, Alex de Minaur, Kei Nishikori slowly rounding back into form. It's an interesting little half here of the draw. What are your initial thoughts on it, Candice?
I think my first thought kind of centers around what you spoke about, that this is a court that can notoriously be a little bit slower. And I think for that reason, we often see very different results here than what we see over in Australia. So, we'll see if we wind up seeing form hold or not, or if maybe some of these guys will have a little bit of a letdown after they maybe have had good performances over in Melbourne. For me, when I looked at this particular section, though, I found it very difficult to get away from the obvious names. When you, of course, see Medvedev there, we know how good that not only in Melbourne, but he's been for the last several months now at this stage. Zverev has been playing fantastic. He seems to be in a nice little pocket there as well. So it really centers around kind of the other two smaller portions of this draw. Who comes out of that de Minaur, Millman, Nishikori, Felix section, and then who comes out of the bottom where you say Roberto Bautista Agut has been playing quite well. Those are maybe the only little bits of uncertainty here. I do think that Medvedev is able to make his way through. I would have him going up against de Minaur, who has handled Millman pretty comfortably in the past, and on paper should be able to defeat Nishikori or Felix, whichever one of them it wound up being. So I have Medvedev going through. I have him going up against Zverev once again, and their history has been fairly one-sided, and I don't necessarily see that changing here.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough. And when you look through the odds as well for this market, and you look at the outrights, Medvedev is the clear favorite, and it's justifiably so based off what he's been able to deliver. I think it was 20 wins in a row and then a loss to Novak Djokovic. So look, it is pretty good form overall. My thoughts when I was looking at this is obviously it is quite a competitive draw, and we do switch back to indoor where Medvedev has been a little bit more hit and miss, and looking at his outright price, I think sitting around that kind of plus 160 or $2.60 range, it was just a little hard to get involved in based off what we saw from him in that final. And it was a little bit of a demolition, I guess, in the end, that Australian Open final, that you could see. I think it was after that first service game from Medvedev that it all kind of went downhill from there. He got all his first serves in, still got broken, and never really kind of found a way back into the match after a couple of soft errors, I think, late in that first set. So I'm a little bit worried about him backing up here against some capable indoor hardcourt players. So, even I don't think he should have too much trouble in the first round, but even looking to maybe a Borna Coric in the second round, that's going to be a pretty tough match for early in the week for Medvedev. But my eyes here kind of gravitate towards Alexander Zverev. And as you mentioned, he should be able to make his way through to the semi-final here. The advantage he has is that Alexander Bublik just played the Singapore final. So, yes, he is in good form, but it's a very quick turnaround for him, which hasn't always gone spectacularly for Bublik. And then also the other seed in this section is Roberto Bautista Agut, who's coming off a long week last week as well. So a pretty favourable section. And then also, the fact that he is pretty solid, I guess, in terms of these conditions as well, and has played pretty well in this slower indoor hard court, in recent times. There's not as many of these tournaments, but I think he's certainly presenting as a chance. I think, if there's a chance for him to knock off Medvedev and make a bit of a case for himself, I think we're looking in this kind of tournament, slightly smaller tournament, perhaps with no Novak and no, Federer or Nadal involved, that this could be a spot to get involved.
Definitely.
Now, any other thoughts here before we move on to the bottom half?
No, I'll save my overarching thought for when we get to our outrights.
That seems fair. Now, if we take a look at the bottom half, it is kind of, at the top here again, it's another player off a very quick turnaround. We've got David Goffin there. Andrei Rublev is obviously the standout name here, along with Stefanos Tsitsipas at the bottom. But, someone who's just snuck into that 8 seed and maybe has a, not too bad a draw, albeit a difficult first round match, is Dan Wawrinka there against Karen Khachanov. Early thoughts here, Candice. Is there anyone standing out to you in this half?
Well, I'm very intrigued by the Wawrinka-Khachanov match just to even begin things. I think that's a match that's going to go very long. If you can find anything remotely decent for the over games there, or for, a 3-setter, I'd be looking in that direction. They've had some fantastic matches in the past. I look at Stan making it through that. The other one that's interesting to me as far as first-round prospects are concerned would be Gerasimov taking a set off Tsitsipas. I don't think he's going to beat him, but I could definitely see him taking a set off of him just stylistically. And, Stefanos is one of those guys who can have some lulls in his matches. So those are the two kind of first-round matches that I have a little bit of interest in. Overall in this section, I look at it being Goffin against Tsitsipas. When it's all said and done, I think you could have some spectacular matches in this section, though. If we get Goffin, Rublev, and then Wawrinka, Tsitsipas, those are two great matches that I'd be looking forward to. I give it to Goffin. He's in very good form. It is a little bit of a quick turnaround for him, but I'm really kind of looking to some of the guys at the early stages of this season who have some match play under their belt and are really fit, because I don't think that's the case for necessarily everybody. And I think some of these older players in particular, maybe it's taking them some matches to really get into the swing of things. Someone like a Wawrinka hasn't necessarily looked himself as of late, but maybe after a couple matches that we saw him in just within the last couple of weeks, we can start to see a little bit better from him. If so, I think he should be able to make it through to playing against Tsitsipas. I'd have the Greek taking him down, but again, should be an interesting match. But for me, overall, my focus is going to be Wawrinka-Khachanov, a first round that going over, and then Gerasimov taking a set off Tsitsipas, and then after that it gets pretty formful. But I would look to Goffin taking out Tsitsipas to get through this section.
Yeah, and I think my only worry here, because I do like the outright price on Goffin. I think it is the quick turnaround that is the worry for him, and Struff is a very capable opponent first up. I do prefer his outright price to Andrei Rublev's outright price, but then having said that, I've been burnt in the past by backing Goffin against Rublev, and it really stung quite a bit that particular day where it just didn't go very well at all. I think, Rublev needs to be respected, but I think I made the comment during the Australian Open that he's just not coming up as outright price value at the moment. His draw does look pretty favourable, but, Humbert is an interesting one in that little pocket there with Goffin and Struff as well, that, he could make a little bit of a run, but I think I'm just going to kind of put my attention elsewhere. I think looking at this part of the draw, my focus also does go towards that Stan versus Khachanov match. And I think, when you look at the outright prices and the overall form, I think Stan is someone that I probably gravitate to a little bit more in terms of, being there at the pointy end of the week. This is probably now the first time in a while that I haven't backed Tsitsipas, so it's probably a case that Tsitsipas will go on a little bit of a run. But again, that's a very tough first couple of rounds there. I know Hurkacz hasn't been in great form, but Mannarino's also been pretty solid. And I don't think Stefanos should be looking past that first round match with Gerasimov. I think that's going to be really tough. But I think when you look at Stan, you think if he could beat Khachanov, he should be beating either Basilashvili or the qualifier. He could really kind of build some momentum, and he's kind of one of those players that he's still able to hold his own against, when you look at the top four in this tournament being Medvedev, Zverev, Rublev, and Tsitsipas, that he should be able to hold his own, even if he isn't in great form. I think, the big opponents and the better opponents normally bring out his best tennis. And I think he's someone that certainly does stand out as being a little bit of value, I think, at the first glance of the outright markets. But what we might do now is there anything else you want to touch on just for this bottom half here, or shall we go into our picks?
I think the only things that I would say regarding this bottom half going forward are, one, I'm really interested if we do wind up seeing Goffin against Rublev in a non-major. Obviously, we've only seen them those two times in the major tournaments. Both of those matches were fairly early. So, from a motivational perspective, does a guy like Goffin, who we see play so much tennis so often, have a little more motivation? That remains to be seen. The other thing that I'm really going to be intrigued by in this section, particularly if Stan does wind up playing Tsitsipas, is I feel like when we saw Tsitsipas lose in, fairly tepid fashion there when it was all said and done, I think it's easy to chalk it up to, well, he had the long match and he had the big comeback against Nadal. But I more looked at it as the kind of the blueprint for everybody on how to beat him was just given to you right there, because he was just relentless against Tsitsipas, going for the backhand over and over and over, and he didn't really do anything to avert that. He didn't. We've seen obviously those tactics against a guy like Federer for years, and he was able to use the slice and different things to kind of combat that in a way that maybe Tsitsipas' game hasn't matured. Not everybody is capable of doing that to him or putting him in that kind of a compromising position, but still someone like Wawrinka might be. So if those two go against each other, that's something I'll be watching for. Like maybe at this point is that kind of the blueprint for taking him down.
Yeah, and I think there's elements with that with Stan, his ability to kind of block that backhand return and then start to, get the ball back in play and go, well, you're going to have to hit a winner here and generate pace. I like your point about that Tsitsipas Medvedev match, I think in the semi-final at the Australian Open. And I think it was a combination of, Tsitsipas was kind of broken down by Medvedev, and it was a very tactically impressive performance from the Russian. But also the tactics from Tsitsipas were way off going back the other way.
Terrible.
And it's one of those ones that because I was sitting there, and the angle that I was sitting at from my seat, kind of watching it, you go there and it's, he's coming into the net, but using so much angle. And if you give a player like Medvedev options in terms of passing shots, either down the line or back cross court, he's got the biggest range, I think, or definitely in kind of the top three in terms of range of options. A lot of players, you think when they get to that point when they're really out wide on their backhand, you go, well, they're probably reaching a point they can only really go down the line here. He's still got that movement and ability to kind of come back cross court and keep you off guard. And I just thought, for all the good that Tsitsipas did up until that match, it all kind of just fell away, I think, with that performance. That I don't know if it was a mentally tired performance, but the tactics just didn't seem there to me. So as a result, Tsitsipas isn't my ace pick for this particular tournament. We might start with you, Candice, and then I'll give my picks and then also what Alex has sent in as well. So who's your pick for the tournament?
My pick is going to be Medvedev for the tournament. I always want to look elsewhere when I wind up on these guys. It's not the plan, but obviously it was very taken from what we saw in Australia. He played incredible. He played well throughout the entire tournament. There was nothing that I could find that was wrong with his game. You don't have Djokovic here to handle. His draw seems to be fine from everything that I see. To me, the way to play this tournament from an outright perspective is you're going between Medvedev and Zverev. You just anticipate they're going to face each other, and you play one of them really hard, and then you completely fade the other guy. So for me, I'm leaning towards Medvedev, just knowing that their history recently. Obviously, he's been fairly dominant in their recent matches against each other. It feels like maybe more than anything, maybe mentally between the two of them right now, there's a little bit of difficulty for Zverev, who, in the early portions of their matchups was really, he had his way with Medvedev. But since Medvedev has improved in these last couple of years, Zverev has had a really tough time beating him. They've had some close matches. Zverev has had his chances, and I just wonder if Medvedev is in his head a little bit. Mm-hmm. And if so, maybe this is the kind of opportunity to finally take him down. But I don't see it necessarily happening just yet.
Yeah, and I think, my pick is Alexander Zverev, but I would have liked him to have been on the other half of the draw to Medvedev, but obviously they will be meeting here in the semi-final. There's kind of two prongs to my thoughts with it, and when you look at the outrights that are available now and also the quarter winner ones, that you're getting Zverev to win the second quarter at just above $2 or plus 100, and it almost feels like making a bit of a play here of perhaps splitting the stake, half quarter winner, half outright. And then, if you were to get through, so if he gets through that quarter, which is full of, as we said, the bigger names who are backing up quite quickly, I think if he can make his way through that quarter, then you've almost got a free roll or a free hit then at the outright as well for Zverev. I just think when you look at his price compared to the other top three seeds, I think he's a little bit longer than he should be. So I think there is a little bit of an appeal there, I think, as a starting point when you look at his price there. And look, I know we've said that Alex has sent in who he said, but he's just basically copied me. He's also gone for Zverev, so we won't go into too much more detail as to what his thoughts are there. But I think there is a bit of value, I think, in that price as well for a top player who's proven himself at these lower tier tournaments, I guess, compared to Grand Slams. Mm-hmm. Now, who is your value pick? Have you gone to the top half, or are you looking down to someone in the bottom half for the value?
I'm going straight down to the bottom to Goffin. The quick turnaround, I can see that being a bit of a concern. I'd be more concerned about it with some other players than him. He's always been a guy who has been able to handle his tennis reasonably well. I like his draw. I know Struff can be capable on his day in that first round. But as we spoke a bit about last week, we have not seen many days like that from him for quite some time. So I'd look for Goffin to make his way through there. Him against Rublev could potentially be very interesting. He's gotten close with him, though, in the past. I think he's capable of beating him, especially at a tournament like this. So I could see Goffin, on my kind of board, Candace's board, I have him, making his way all the way to the final. So for me, at the odds you're sitting at, I think that he's that player for these kinds of guys. For a Rublev, for a Tsitsipas, assuming Tsitsipas is able to beat Wawrinka, for some of these younger guys who they have a ton of talent, but maybe their game isn't fully matured. He's that guy who can just be the kind of the thorn in your side, and I see him playing that role here. The kind of the fly that you can never swat away.
Yeah, no, and that seems more than fair enough. And I think it's certainly an attackable little part. I do wish he kind of lost a couple of rounds earlier last week, but I think, certainly I don't think Goffin would be complaining too much. He's been able to win the title there, and it's a good shot of confidence for him as well. Now, Alex's pick for the value was Stan Wawrinka, and Stan is also actually one of my value picks. I've kind of got two, and I put a little asterisk next to Borna Coric. So when we're talking through the draw, I do prefer Stan, I think, from an outright perspective. I think, I prefer his chances, I think, against some of these bigger names as we get deeper into the tournament, if he were to make it. The Coric play, just having a look at some of the outrights that are out there at the moment, there was I think one for him to win the quarter, that first quarter at, I think it was $9 or $10, which I think is decent value there. He would have to face Medvedev in the second round, but I do think I'd rather be facing Medvedev earlier than later this week. And I think it's, you can sometimes catch him off guard against some of these lower ranked players. Coric was poor, at the Australian Open, but did suffer, I think, a little bit in the heat in his loss to McDonald. So give him a little bit of a forgive there. But I just think looking at his price for his outright versus just the quarter winner, I think Coric is more of a quarter winner approach, whereas Stan's more of an outright overall approach, looking at what's available. Now, from an unforced error perspective, there wasn't, I don't think, anything that really stood out to a lot of us outside of my pick here was Roberto Bautista Agut, just because of the quick turnaround coming off his tournament, finishing only a couple of hours ago and losing that one from a setup. Alex had gone with David Goffin, basically for a similar reason, but just because he likes to go against Candice in some way, shape, or form every episode.
Gotta do it.
Yeah, there's no other way. And I don't think you didn't have one, I think, in this one,
No.
did you, Candice? No. So we'll move on to basically our overvalued player, which looks awfully familiar to the opposite of our eighth pick for this tournament. So we may need to figure out what we're going to do here. But we'll start with you, Candice. Who's your pick as your overvalued player?
So my overvalued player is going to be Alexander Zverev. It's not for anything against him. I think he's great. I think he could make it far. I just mathematically think that's the correct way to play the tournament. So sorry, Alex.
That's right. Alex has gone for Medvedev, and so have I. And I think it's that case of, yes, I think he does. I wouldn't be surprised if he did win. I just don't see the value in his price. I think in these kind of tournaments, he's showing at that Masters 1000 and that Grand Slam level that he's starting to kind of match to that level. And I just don't know if maybe that consistency or desire is quite there at some of the lower tournaments, and he's coming off that loss. I'm just interested to see how he starts the week. He's got a relatively easy start, I think, against Lovic, but it does get pretty tough pretty quickly, and I just want to see how he is coming off, now a second Grand Slam final loss. So we will see what unfolds there. Now, I think that just about wraps up Rotterdam. So we might switch over now from the indoor hard court over to the clay in Argentina.
Woo-woo.
So this draw, for Buenos Aires, is going to be, and I'll just pop it up on the screen here as well. So we're on the clay, and we'll look at the first half as well. So the top seed, I do feel a little sorry for Diego Schwartzman, who does seem to play a lot of tournaments at home and perhaps not bring his best tennis in front of his home crowds at times. And here's the top seed here, backing up again from Cordoba last week. The other seeds, we've got Francis Tiafoe sneaks in as the 8th seed, which is an interesting one.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I don't know if I want to say anything more on that. We'll just refer to that as an interesting one. He has shown some form in patches on clay, but it's interesting when you look at the other seeds here. So we go Kekmanovic and Laszlo Djere, and you look at some of these clay players who aren't seeded. He's done well to sneak in at the 8th seed. What stands out to you here in this first half?
Well, I was glad you mentioned Tiafoe, because that was the first thing when I saw the draw and I was going through match by match, and I'm like, oh, he's here. It was a curious schedule, but whatever works for him. The first thing that jumped off is Schwartzman's draw. I don't think is necessarily sensational. I spoke fairly glowingly last week about Andres Martin, who is very capable on the surface. Obviously, we wound up seeing him lose in the first round last week. I think he was against a qualifier, and that qualifier wound up being Tomasz Martin Echeverry, who's a very young, 20, 21 years old, plays in Argentina. I think he only had his main draw debut this year, right, at Delray Beach. So, kind of a young kid on the rise. It's a loss that, to a degree, I can forgive. But, I'm not saying he's going to beat Schwartzman, but that's, you're going against a very, very good clay court specialist, veteran at that point. That's not an easy match to go through right off the back of a bye. And it doesn't get any easier from there with local players who obviously love this kind of a surface. So it'll be interesting with Schwartzman. Obviously, a lot of pressure, you would imagine, really flying the flag for Argentina in a time where, we're not seeing as many top players for them as we did maybe 10, 15 years ago. So we'll see how that goes. I don't project him going incredibly far, but obviously you hope that he's able to do well. For me, jumping off on this kind of top half, I'm going to be really intrigued to see what we can get from Laszlo Djere. I've been impressed with his play for quite some time now, to be frank with you. Even in defeats, it seems like often he's played well. He got the short end of the stick first round over Melbourne, of course, having to go up against Nadal. But this is a player who definitely has has ability, and in particular on this surface. So when I look through it, I had Laszlo Djere making it through. I think it's helpful to him to be on the bottom portion of this draw and have a couple of these. When you look to a group like Carballos Baena, Montero, Buenos, Cirundolo, like they have to take each other out before he has to face them. And I think that's going to be beneficial in the long run.
Yeah. And I think, I don't have a whole lot to add, I think, to what you've just said there. I think you've covered off that really well. I think that second quarter there, it is a pretty stacked section in a way, but I think, I wouldn't be surprised to see, whoever comes out of that section to be a genuine threat, I think, to Schwartzman or Tiafoe or whoever it is that finds their way out of that first quarter. So look, I've kind of made, my value selection will come out of this second quarter here, but it's taking a little bit of a longer shot through here. And it's nothing against, Djere or Cecchinato. I think they're all obviously very capable players. It's just going to be, it's a very tough draw, I think, from a clay perspective. Diego, having watched a couple of his matches this past week, he beat Cecchinato, but Cecchinato kind of beat himself, I think, in that particular match. And then he just didn't look great. He didn't look himself, I think, for patches against Ramos when he lost in 3 sets. Again, Schwartzman kind of falls into that Medvedev kind of category here for me. I'm just not really enticed to get involved in these really short prices, I think, in these type of tournaments. But yeah, I'm really interested to see who comes out of this second section. And I think Kekmanovic is lucky to get the bye to start off, because it's going to get pretty tough for him pretty quickly. Now, shall we head on to the second half?
Moving on.
Alrighty, and at the top here we have Pablo Andujar facing off again. There's a couple of these matches that start off. So Andujar versus Londero, that they're pretty solid clay court first round matchups. So we will move down. Got Salvatore Caruso, his first appearance since getting into an argument with Fabio Fognini, I think, in Melbourne. Got Federico Coria, who put together a decent week, coming up against a qualifier. Benoit Paire wins another round, so he gets a first round bye, so he automatically earns some ATP points this week. And then moving to the bottom quarter, we've got Albert Ramos, Holger Rune, Kupfer, who's I'll get your thoughts on this section first, but Dominic Kupfer is someone who really confuses me, I think, on clay over the last kind of 12 months or so, or since the tour restarted, but I'll talk more about him in a little bit. Yao Souza, back in action, and down to the very bottom, we didn't see him in Melbourne, but Christian Gurin is here as the 2 seed, and when you look at the draw and the strength of the draw, this might be a good opportunity for him to kickstart his 2021. But what are your thoughts here, Candice?
I thought that this portion of the draw was very difficult, more difficult, at least for me, to make my way through than the top. We have Benoit Paire, who feels like he's the gimme, but that's about it with everybody else in here. That Andujar-Londero match is going to be a really good one. I think whoever makes it through that match feasibly could be the person who would make it through this section. For me, aside from that, when you start making your way down to more towards the bottom, when you're seeing guys here like, even like Ramos Vinolas, that's a really tough barometer. And I think that's kind of the hallmark of this tournament, are that the guys who even aren't, the Schwartzmans or the biggest names, they're tough outs. These are guys who've been around for a long time. They love this surface. They are grinders. They'll go long, and you've got to really earn it against some of these kind of lower seeded players, no matter who you are, no matter who you're against. I think for me, when I went through it, ultimately kind of my biggest thing was trying to kind of fade Guerin a little bit. I really respect him. I respect his ability. I just think that bottom portion of this draw is a minefield of those veteran types of players. For me, I had Andujar making it through against Londero in a toughie, but if he can do that, I do think the top portion is much more favorable to him, and I looked to him to make it through. But for him, it feels like for him, it's all hinged on that first round match. Either he maybe makes it to the final, or he loses right there.
Yeah, and I think this just shows how tough this draw is. And I think also when we covered, I think, Cordoba last week as well, but at the time of covering this to try and get things out before, the first round starts, qualifiers not being placed can turn things into a minefield even more so, as we saw with Cherundolo winning, I think, the tournament in Cordoba, from a qualifying position. And again, when you look at these players and you look at some of the wild cards here as well, that that they're not pushovers. They're not some of the wild cards we might see in some of those Doha and Dubai tournaments that rock up in qualifying and struggle to win a game or two. This is a genuinely it's a high quality field. I think when you look at the strength of the quarters and the fact that he does have the first round bye, I do gravitate towards Garin here. I think it is a relatively okay draw. Sousa hasn't looked in great form. Depends which qualifier kind of drops there. If Juan Munar, for example, or Altmaier, the winner of that one, that could be a first round match here, and it's the final round of qualifying. If either of those two end up there, then that's a really tricky start. And again, I think another one on upset alert, I think, for the start of the tournament, and I can't really consider him from an outright, is Kopfer, against Turante. I think that's going to be a tricky one. And when you look back through some of his better performances, I think it was through Rome and through that kind of Europe swing last year that he played some top names pretty well, but his breakpoint save percentages through those tournaments was just absurd to the point of being unable to replicate it. So I don't think he's actually as good perhaps on clay as some of the recent stats may have it. And when you look through his kind of recent clay record, again, Benoit Paire, he did get a win. He did win as an underdog against, was it Jarry last week? But it is, again, hard to make a case for him to put together that kind of tennis for an entire week. And I agree with what you said. I think that, Londero and Aha, whoever wins that one, it's probably it's a start to a very good week, I think, for them. So it's certainly tricky, and it's not the easiest draw I think we've covered for the year. But it's going to be interesting to see kind of what unfolds now for the second week in a row in Argentina. Now, if we head into our top picks, we might start with you, Candice, and then I'll kind of jump in with mine and Alex's. Who's your pick for the tournament?
Well, I have to be the rule breaker around here. So yep. I don't have a pick. I'm combining everything together. So my top pick is Pablo Andahar and Laszlo Djere. Just because when I was going through the two of them, I was seeing them at very similar prices in outrights. And so for me, I would just be looking to Dutch the two of them. You still get significant value by way of doing that because they're both big enough prices to begin with. For Laszlo, I spoke about it. Love his draw in particular. Love that he's on the bottom side there towards on the top half. And for Andahar, I honestly think I'm just playing a first round match as an outright. So I'm going to go with the two of them, hope that they make the final, and then we're happening.
Exactly. And then you're all set. You don't need to worry about a thing. Yep. I've gone for Christian Garin as my pick. Again, trying to get away from, I think Diego's a little bit too short based off what we saw last week as well. And this is Alex's pick as well. I think, it's as favorable can get in a starting point, I think, for a draw that is very, very tricky. Obviously didn't travel down to Melbourne and go through everything that everyone else went through. So it is trying to kind of weigh up of how much tennis, that lack of match practice and how much that kind of weighs into it. But I think, I probably won't be getting involved in his first match on court, but I think from an outright perspective, I think there's value there. And, Alex's pick is the same. And look, he'll probably just say the exact same thing as I do. So we'll just kind of continue on from there. Now, because you've picked those two, you don't have a value pick for this section or this draw. So my value pick, I've gone a little bit wider and I've kind of gone into that second quarter where things got a little bit dicey with a couple of really good names. But I've gone for Federico Del Bonis. He's sitting at, I think, just over 30-1 in the outright markets at the moment. Again, probably not interested in match to match, but, has the ability to kind of get on a bit of a run and I think has the game, if things click, to be able to challenge a Schwartzman in a semi-final if they were to meet. He gets Cherundolo in the first round, who's coming off the biggest, probably the biggest 4 matches of his career, which culminated in winning the title in Cordoba. So, he comes in here as the exemption, but it's going to be a quick turnaround. So I think Del Bonis is in a good position there. Had some chances, I think, in his match in Cordoba last week and just couldn't serve out the second set to get things back on level footing. So I think, just at a bigger price, that is the one that stood out to me. And Alex's value pick, which I think also falls in a kind of similar kind of portion, is Marco Cecchinato, who, has looked, the difference between his best and his worst is extreme. And again, he's going up against, I think, Jair in the first round. He'd need to be a lot better than he was last week, but I think we've seen, being able to go so deep into Roland Garros a couple of years ago, we know what he's capable of. It's just a matter of whether it all clicks. And again, it's probably a case of, he may be able to kind of string it all together, or he loses to Jair 2-2 in, just over an hour, and he's off and on his way. So look, it is hard to. These draws can be tricky to analyze. One, without the qualifiers place, but two, because so many of these first round matches are going to be so decisive, I think, when you look at the overall outright picture. So trying to pick these ones, yes, we could sit here and pick Buenos and pick, a lot of these players. They could all very well lose in the first round. I'm still comfortable with that, and that's what's built into these prices. But there is kind of that weighing up of, I'd rather take, a 30-1 in an outright than take $1.60 in something that I'm not quite sure about in the first round. So I was just trying to play the numbers there, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. I mean, contrary to, it's a very different type of tournament from a wagering perspective than, say, Rotterdam, where there are a lot more, maybe first round matches that are interesting, whether it be from a winner's perspective or from, a prop perspective. But in this tournament, like you say, so many of these matches in the first round feel particularly decisive to the overall outcome. And so I'm with you. I'd rather play somebody at 50-1 outright than play them at minuscule odds when, that first round match could be the whole state of their tournament.
Yeah, and we touched on it a bit yesterday in the WTA one, and it does, look, it doesn't always work. Sometimes it does, and the example I raised yesterday with Alex was this situation of outright versus head-to-head is the exact situation I took with Iga Swiatek in Roland Garros last year, because she was an underdog to start against Vondrousova. And, there are these opportunities that do pop up, and then obviously, it was obviously great that Swiatek could beat everyone so convincingly along the way, and that was a little bit unexpected. But there are these
minor details.
It's a small detail, but there are these spots here that you need to kind of pick and look at it and go, well, in this instance, I'm not interested in Cecchinato against Jair in the first round, but you could make a case that if he were to win that and find his way through this section, the Kekmanovic quarter is, a relatively attackable quarter. And he's in the same half as the Schwartzman, who we have some question marks over, and Tiafoe as the other seed. So look, there's a lot, I think, that could work really well there for him, but also, knowing his ceiling and knowing how deep his basement goes in terms of performance, it is tricky to kind of get a gauge on him. And that is why sometimes there is a bit of value on him. Mm-hmm. If we have a look to the unforced errors, there's a very similar theme here so Alex and I have basically gone for the different finalists from Cordoba. So I've gone for Cerundolo, and Alex has gone for Albert Ramos. Again, that quick turnaround. Clay can be a grind, longer matches. It can build up, particularly early in the season. It can be a quick turnaround for some of these players. And I don't think you had an unforced error, I think, for this one, did you, Candace? So we will move on to who your overvalued player is for the tournament.
I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I thought that Diego Schwartzman was the overvalued player in this tournament. We've said all the same reasons why last week. I don't think this is necessarily any different. For me, he doesn't particularly play super well in Argentina in general. But two, I think that, I spoke about it last week a bit, but for being an Argentinian, I think you anticipate that the difference between his form on hard court and his difference between his form on clay courts should be much larger than it is. Obviously, he's very good on clay. He's very good on hard courts too. But in some of these early tournaments to this kind of clay season, I've looked more to guys, and I think there are other guys who provide more value, whose form on hard courts is terrible because their hard court level is poor. and then they're moving to the clay court, and that discrepancy in their form could make a much larger difference. I think that's the way to play it, because you're going to get better odds at this time of the year.
Definitely. And I can keep rolling through these banners. We've all got Diego Schwartzman, I think, as the overvalued player. And again, like we've said through here, it's not to say that he won't win the tournament. I think there's enough question marks around form. And then also, he has kind of had a couple of letdown performances, I think, at home in front, in his home country. Obviously, the crowds won't be to the same level, obviously, that we've seen in previous years in terms of some of those South American crowds, particularly late in tournaments, which is a shame. But that's, we're just grateful, I think, that there is tennis to be played at the moment. But yeah, I think there's enough question marks, I think, that there for Diego. And that about wraps up, I think, episode 15. So we've covered off. We did. We survived without Alex.
We didn't need him.
No, exactly. We might have to extend out that suspension. We'll have to discuss. I think we'll have to put it to a vote, and we'll probably win that 2-1.
Yeah.
So we will be back, hopefully at some point this week we want to get back to covering the challenges in some capacity this week as well, but it might be a little bit later in the week, perhaps, if we can try and catch maybe when we're getting towards the pointy end and talk about some key players. I'm going to try and get an article up a little bit later for some players to watch at challenger level for this week, and then maybe we can kind of touch base and have an episode looking at the pointy end of all the challenges and who we're keen to keep an eye on. Anything else from you, Candice, for this episode?
Nope, that's it.
Perfect. Thank you very much for everyone who's tuned in live or who's listening back on any of the podcast formats. I think we're on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. We're basically on anything. So if you do search for Eat Sleep Tennis and make sure you download the podcasts and give us a review or a rating or a thumbs up or a subscribe, or everything's a little bit different. It's such a typical 2021 thing, but we really appreciate everyone who's kind of tuned in, given us feedback over the last couple of weeks. As I said, this is the 15th episode here now. We're just getting to the end of February, so there's going to be a lot of episodes ahead, and we've really appreciated the support so far. Thanks for tuning in, and if you do have any questions, you can get in touch with us at Eat Sleep Tennis on Twitter, and we will talk to you next time.